In this movie, I'll show you how, in Photoshop, to paint a glowing jack-o'-lantern face on a pumpkin. And that way you won't have to clean the pumpkin and you don't run the risk of hurting yourself either. I'm going to switch over to this image, which is the base photograph from the Fotolia image library. And what you want to do is draw yourself a face. And notice that I've gone ahead and drawn the image on its own layer. So we've got black paint on an independent layer, which is very important here. It's just set against white background so I can better see what I'm doing. And actually, if I zoom in, you'll see that I've got some problems here. I apparently painted these outlines with the brush tool and then filled things in with the paint bucket. And as a result, I have some sort of white slivers. If you encounter that kind of thing and you just want to fill your drawing in very quickly, what you do is you go up to the filter menu, you choose other, and then you choose the minimum command. And that will expand the minimum luminance level, which is black. And at a radius of just 1 pixel, that ends up filling in all the gaps there. So I'll click OK in order to apply that. And then I'll go ahead and zoom back out. And I'll right-click inside the image window with my rectangular marquee tool. And I'll choose Duplicate Layer. And then I'll go ahead and send this layer over to AdorableLittleGirl.tiff and click OK. All right, now I'll switch back to said Adorable Girl and drag the pumpkin face down a little bit. Now I want to scale and position this face, and I want to do so non-destructively, so I'll convert the layer to a Smart Object by clicking in the upper right-hand corner of the Layers panel and choosing Convert to Smart Object. And next I'll go ahead and scale the image by going up to the Edit menu and choosing the Free Transform command, or I could press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac. I know in advance what values I want to use, so I'll go ahead and link the width and height values together. Then I'll click on the W to select the width value, and I'll dial in a new value of 42%. I also know exactly where I want to position this element, so I'm going to dial in some X and Y values here. For X, this is for my image. If you're working in your own image, you'd come up with something else. But I'm going to dial in 510 pixels. And then for the Y value, I'll dial in 2155, and then press the Enter key or the Return key on a Mac a couple of times in order to put that pumpkin face where it needs to be. All right, now I'm going to zoom in on this guy a little bit here. I created a mask, you may recall, in the previous movie, and rather than recreating that mask, I'm just going to load it up. And the mask is going to mask away the arm here, so the pumpkin face appears to be behind the girl's arm. So I'll switch over to the Channels panel, and then I'll press the Control key or the Command key on the Mac and click on the arm mask thumbnail in order to load it as a selection outline. Then I'll switch back to the Layers panel, and with that basic layer selected, it should really be called Outside because these are going to be the outside edges of the carving. Then I'll drop down to the Add Layer Mask icon at the bottom of the panel and click on it, and that'll go ahead and mask the arm away. Now this guy needs to be filled with a different color. So I'm going to double click on the Smart Object Layers thumbnail right there. And if you get this alert message, just go ahead and click OK in order to bring up the Smart Object. I want to give it a little more room just so I'm not cutting off any edges. So I'll go up to the Image menu and choose the Canvas Size command. With the relative checkbox on, I'll go ahead and dial in a width and height value of 20 pixels apiece, and then click OK. And as I say, that just gives me a little wiggle room so nothing gets cut off. Now I want to fill this layer with a different color. So I'm going to dial that color into the Color panel. Notice that I've got my HSB values active. If you don't, and you're working along with me, then you can click on the flyout menu icon and choose HSB sliders. And I'll dial in a hue value of 15 degrees. And then I'll change the saturation to 80%, and I'll change the brightness value to 40%. And then with that dark shade of red as my foreground color, I'll recolor my artwork by pressing Shift-Alt-Backspace. That would be Shift-Option-Delete on the Mac. And now I'll just go ahead and close this Smart Object, click the Yes button in order to save the changes. On the Mac, you go ahead and click on the Save button. That's changed my layer mask for some darn reason. I'm not exactly sure why that happened. Just to make sure the mask is everything it's supposed to be, I'm going to right-click on that layer mask and choose Delete Layer Mask. I'll go back to the Channels panel and Control-click or Command-click on that arm mask to reload it, switch back to the Layers panel, and then click on the Add Layer Mask icon again in order to reload that mask. So sorry about that snafu, but had to fix it, of course. All right, now I want to add a little bit of darkness around the edges. So I'll drop down to the FX icon and choose Outer Glow, which will give me a consistent band of color the whole way around. I'll click on the color swatch in order to bring up the color picker dialog box. And now I'm going to dial in shade of orange by changing the hue value to 40 degrees. I'll change the saturation to 100% and the brightness to 80%. Click OK. change the blend mode from screen to multiply, and then I'll take the opacity value down to 50%, and I'll tab my way down to the size value and change it to 10 pixels. So we have just a little bit of edge darkening there. Now I'll click on the OK button. Now we need to create another layer, another version of this jack-o'-lantern face that's going to serve as the inside edges. And you do that by clicking on the layer in order to select it, and then press Control-Alt-J or Command-Option-J on the Mac in order to jump a copy of the layer and bring up the new layer dialog box. And I'll change the name to inside this time and click OK. I do not need the layer mask where this layer is concerned, so I'll right-click on that layer mask thumbnail and choose Delete Layer Mask. And then I'll press the Control key or the Command key on the Mac and click on that horizontal line between the two layers to clip the inside edges inside the outside edges. We don't need this outer glow, so I'll just go ahead and drag it to the trash can. We do, however, need to color the inside edges. And I'll do so by dropping down to the FX icon and this time choosing Gradient Overlay. And the style of overlay I'm interested in applying is radial. Then I'll click on the gradient bar to bring up the gradient editor dialog box, and I'll double click on the first color swatch and change it to a hue value of 60, a saturation of 75%, and a brightness value of 100%. Then I'll click OK. And now I'll double click on the final color stop, which is white by default, and I'll change it to 40, 100, 100. That is for the HSB values. And then click OK for that guy as well. Click OK for the gradient editor in order to dismiss it. Increase the scale value to 150%, which is the absolute maximum. And I'm going to go ahead and drag this gradient to about this location here. That is, it's going to begin right about here and proceed to orange along the side. Now I'll click OK in order to accept that change. We need to once again scale and position this layer. So I'll press Control-T or Command-T on the Mac in order to enter the free transform mode. I'll link the W and H values together so that I can apply a proportional resize, and I'll change that W value to 38%. Then I'm going to Shift-Tab over to the position values here, specifically the X value, and I'll change it to 475, and then I'll tab over to the Y value and change it to 2162. Again, just happens to work well for this specific image. Then I'll press the Enter key a couple of times or the Return key a couple of times on the Mac. Now we need to create the depth along the teeth, for example, so that we have a continuous edge. So I'm going to add a new layer mask to this inside layer by dropping down to the Add Layer Mask icon at the bottom of the panel and clicking on it. That should, by default, fill the mask with white. Now I'll press the L key in order to switch over to my lasso tool. I'm going to Alt-click around here. This would be an Option click like so in order to create a polygonal selection outline, and then release the Alt-Option key when you've selected the right area. Assuming that your foreground color is black, which it is for me, then you press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete on the Mac in order to mask that area away so it looks like we have a continuous edge. Now it's just a matter of repeating that same operation a few times for the other teeth here. It's going to help a lot if you've got a pretty simple face in the first place. I'll go and press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete to fill that area. Then I'll Alt-click around here. And by the way, I'm clicking before I start a new selection outline to deselect the previous one. That way, Alt-clicking or Option-clicking on a Mac will go ahead and draw a polygonal selection outline instead of subtracting from the existing selection. So I want to go ahead and select this region right here and press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete on the Mac to fill it with black. Go ahead and do the same thing for this guy right there. We're almost done. Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete to fill it. And then go up to the top here, this right-hand eye, and you want to Alt-click right about there. That'd be an Option-click on the Mac. And then just go ahead and click your way around and press Alt-Backspace or Option-Delete in order to fill that selection. And then finally, I'll click off the selection to deselect it. Let's go ahead and zoom out so that we can see the entire jack-o'-lantern face. We need the glow to emanate into this edge, and we're going to do that using a drop shadow. Go ahead and click on the FX icon and choose the drop shadow command. It's located at the bottom of the list here in CS6. It appears at the top of the list in CS5 and earlier. And now I want to change the color here, so I'll click on the color swatch and I'll dial in a color of 40, 100, 100. For the HSB values, that shade of orange we've been using a few times now. Click OK. And I'll go ahead and drag the dialog box over so I can see the entire image. I'll increase the opacity value to 100%, and I'll change the blend mode to normal. so that we have just solid color here, and we're not getting any interaction between this color and the edge itself. Then I'll increase the distance value to 30 pixels. I want a spread of 0%, and I want a size of 30 pixels as well. And I'll change the angle value here to 180 degrees. And then finally, just for the sake of a little bit of realism here, I'm going to take that noise value up to 5%. So we have just a little bit of noise operating inside of this glow that's being projected out of the pumpkin onto the edges. Now go ahead and click OK in order to accept that effect. Now I figure some of that glow ought to come outside the pumpkin. So I'm going to press Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N on the Mac to make a new layer, and I'll call it Glows, and then I'll click OK. And now I'm going to switch to the Brush tool, which I can get by pressing the B key. And if I right-click inside the image window, you can see that the size is set to 300 pixels and the hardness is 0%. Now I'll dial in a new foreground color, 60 for the hue value, 100% for saturation, and 100% for brightness. And I'll click right about there to add some glow coming out of that eye. Then I'll press the 5 key to reduce the opacity value up here in the options bar to 50%. And I'll click right about there and right there as well to add a little bit more glow coming out of the pumpkin's face. And then finally, it seems to me, if I zoom in here, you can see that we've got kind of a rough edge on this arm. Click on the Layer Mask thumbnail for the outside layer, and I'll go up to the Select menu and choose Refine Mask, or I could press Control-Alt-R or Command-Option-R on the Mac. I'm going to dial in a feather value of 2 pixels. I'll increase the contrast value to 50%, and then I'm going to shift the edge up to 20% like so. And while that doesn't do a perfect job, as you can see, it does make things considerably better. Then I'll click OK in order to accept that effect. And finally, just because I have a little bit of a weird edge right there, I'm going to grab my smudge tool, which I can get from the Blur Tool flyout menu. I'll just go ahead and paint out ever so slightly like so. I'll press the F key a couple of times in order to switch to the full screen mode, and then zoom out from my image so that we can see this very, very cute girl and her absolutely pretty amazingly photorealistic jack-o'-lantern, given how little work we put into the project.